Today we're talking about composition. Now, composition, raise your hand. Let me see your hands. If you have heard of composition, you think of composition as like the rule of thirds and like those basic topics. Anybody? Okay, so pretty much generally everybody. I'm going to get into some bonus items in composition that are actually going to help because I feel like a lot of people when they hear the term rule of thirds or, the golden mean, the golden ratio, all of those things, they're talked about to death. And pretty much as everybody has heard of those things, but not everybody has heard about everything that we're going to be talking about today. And I believe that you don't have to have the best camera, right? You don't have to have the best lenses. What you really need to be focusing on, and the best part about this is it's totally free, is you have to work on your composition to get great photos. And it's not just me that says that. We can go all the way back to when Ansel Adams was still kicking and he was talking about the best place or the best photo is knowing where to stand. When you're talking about the best photo is knowing where to stand, it's not whoever can spend the most money to get out to Yosemite National Park. It's not whoever can spend the most money on the best camera equipment. Knowing where to stand is simply knowing how to adjust your composition for higher perspectives, getting around this tree, watching the edges of your frame to be sure everything is within the frame and the whole story is told. So today we're going to be talking about those things. We're also going to be getting a few tips from the Hollywood industry on how they create movies that you love and how they build impact with their movies and how you can take those lessons and apply them to your own photography. So we can take what Hollywood is doing in movies or authors do in books, and we can apply the same thing to our photography. I'm going to get started by sharing my window with you guys. Hit share and then hit the slideshow, and we can all see that now. Okay, so who am I, first of all? And why are you listening to me talking about this? Well, my name's David Johnston, as Wade told you. First and foremost, I'm a girl dad and a husband. I have a daughter and a wife, and I am a photographer. I've worked with companies like Tamron, Fujifilm, OM System, and REI, brands like that. And I'm also an entrepreneur. I've helped thousands of photographers improve their photography, both in field and workshops. More importantly, for me, how I can reach the most amount of people is online, teaching people how to take better photos through webinars, teaching sessions like this, and virtual workshops as well as courses. So that's kind of what I do here. Now, over time, I started ditching the idea of saying that you need a better camera, or thinking that in my head, or you need to spend this amount of money on camera. People won't start taking you seriously. Ultimately, I started working on composition and started to create photos like these. Now, when I started to take photos like these, it got the attention of those camera brands that I was talking about, brands like REI having my photos shown in their stores. I was invited to speak on stages with National Geographic photographers to talk about photography and composition, how to frame up everything in a really nice way. There's ways that you can do that to a few people at a time, and there's ways that you can do that to a lot of people at a time. I like to reach the most amount of people possible so that everybody can take photos that they love and everybody can learn to be happier with their photography to do that. Now, I'm going to blow right past this topic just because you guys raise your hands. You know what I'm talking about when I'm talking about the rule of thirds, right? It's the basic principle that you line up your photo to match this grid that you can see on your computer when you're cropping your photos, sometimes on the back of your camera screen. It's basically the idea that you line up the subjects of your photo along these grid lines so that it looks the most aesthetically pleasing. And I put those in quotations because, as we'll see, you are also allowed to break those rules. Now, when I took this photo, I was lining everything up. I had everything lined up in the field at Grand Teton National Park. I was waiting for this light with a wide angle lens, and ultimately I saw this amazing windstorm at the top of the Teton Peak start to go off, and I framed it with a telephoto lens instead to get a lot of that wind and atmosphere and energy in the top of those peaks. But lining everything up properly is the way that you can frame up some really nice shots. Now, the second way is through the golden mean. Now, here's the formula for the actual golden mean. 1 plus the square root of 5 seconds equals 1 point whatever. I was not a good math student. I was not a good student at all. I'll be completely honest with you guys. But I think if you just understand the basic principle of what the golden mean actually looks like and how you can apply it to your photography, you can start using this in your composition to frame up your subject. Now, this pertains to the subject of your photo. So nothing else really in the photo matters with this. It's where you're aligning your subject in the photo to look the most aesthetically pleasing. Now, this was created back in the Renaissance period of creating artwork, and this was a mathematical equation that those artists used to frame up their photos. We can do the same thing in scenes like this from Great Smoky Mountains National Park, a historical cabin out there, but using the golden mean or the golden ratio, as we can look at here, you're basically trying to fit your subject as close to the closing of what I like to call the snail shell here. So it looks like a big snail shell. You try to put your subject right around that same area and it'll have the most impact for a photo. Now, the golden ratio looks a little bit something like this, but ultimately it is the exact same thing. You see where all these lines come together in the top right, and we can flick through these. Sorry, I went back one too far. Flick back through these, and you can see that those two alignments are pretty much in the exact same place. So if you're placing your subjects along these lines, along these sections, you're getting a great opportunity to put your subject in the most aesthetically pleasing. Now, when it comes to subject placement, and I'm going to spread it, I do mainly landscape photography, but I know a lot of you guys in the group take a lot of different kinds of photos. So I'm going to try to spread this out as much as possible. When the opportunity presents itself, I am out there taking wildlife photos. This is the elk rut in Rocky Mountain National Park. A beautiful time of year to go photographing, and the elk are amazing. They're massive, massive animals that you can go out and photograph, and sometimes they'll walk right up to you on the road. What you don't see in a lot of these photos is about 2,000 of your closest photography friends shoulder to shoulder with you photographing the exact same elk. Sometimes you can get a little bit away from the crowd and photograph some amazing photos in solitude, but ultimately people are going to flock to where these elk actually are. This was in the golden light late in the day. Subject placement is a funny thing in photography. We just learned about the rule of thirds, the golden mean, but subject placement has a lot more to do with just putting it in the right spot, right? Subject placement allows us to see things and feel certain emotions based on where your subject is placed. So let's think about your favorite Hollywood movie, right? Every Hollywood movie follows the exact same principles of a storyline. You get an introduction to the character, you get their goal or what they hope to attain in the photo, then they have a conflict in the photo, and then they have a resolution of that conflict. Every story follows that exact same script. So in your photography, you can bring up the emotions of that script based on where you place your subject in the frame. You see, this elk is facing to the right. Now, opening up more space in front of your subject allows for your viewer to feel more hopeful and more ambitious about the photo. Things are brighter, things are a lot more positive feeling. If you want your subjects and your photos to look a lot more moody, you would put less space in front of your subjects so your viewer would actually feel a little bit more stuck and a little bit more friction in how you're telling the story of your photograph. This doesn't have to be just with wildlife. This can be with landscape. This can be with city photography, portrait photography, anything you want to do with that. And lighting helps a lot too. You notice this lighting is very golden. There's a lot of nice bright lighting, and there's a lot of space right there in front of your subject. So think about that when you're going through. You can also do the same thing. Where is your subject gazing? Where are they looking into the frame, and where can they see off into the future? So if you look at this photo here, this is actually a self-portrait in East Tennessee of a towering waterfall. If you look up on the top of this frame, you can see that there's more space put where the subject or myself is gazing into the top of the frame. So they're looking higher up into the frame. They're seeing more of that waterfall, and things feel lighter, more hopeful, gazing towards optimism. The reason I did that with this photo in particular was that it's spring, right? Winter is over. You can see the spring leaves starting to bud out from the trees, and there's a lot of positivity in the air. You can also do this with abstract photography. This is in Great Sand Dunes National Park out in Colorado. And the sand dunes out there are just massive. They're huge, and they have these really stark, sharp lines. And they really pop out late in the afternoon when the sun is putting side light on them, and you get a casting shadow across some of the other sand dunes. So you can see that come across the frame. Now, what's cool about these sand dunes is they also have a lot of green shrubs that are coming up and growing out of the sand dunes themselves. This location is actually home to the tallest sand dune in North America. It's called Star Dune. You can hike out to it. It's just an amazing location. It's a lot harder to hike on sand dunes than you would think. Now, I also want to talk about horizon lines here. There's so much to talk about with horizon lines because you actually have many options when it comes to your horizons in your photos. When you're talking about horizons, a lot of times you think about where the sky is meeting the earth, right? That long distance horizon line photo, maybe you're thinking of something like a beach scene where the water is meeting the sky. A lot of times when you're photographing, you can also think of the horizon line is where plains meet mountains. This is also in Great Sand Dunes National Park. You can see the peak of Star Dune over on the left side of the frame, how tall that is compared to the flat plains that lead up to this location, and then the San Juan Mountains in the distance, and how those look compared to the size of all of these sand dunes. So again, an amazing location, especially late in the day when you're getting a lot of that side light cast on the dunes, on the San Juan Mountains. But using your horizon line effectively a lot of times is how you would master a scene like this. So when you're going out and taking a photo like this, you want to think about where is the energy of the photo? Where is all the energy happening? And ultimately, that helps you decide where you want to place your horizon line. Since this was not the best sunset I've ever been to, all the energy was in the plains down at the bottom, the sand dunes, and the mountains. So you see that takes up two-thirds of the entire frame. I think one of the mistakes a lot of photographers make when they're going out and taking photos is that they are taking photos and putting the horizon line dead in the middle of the photo. That's okay in certain situations, but a lot of times you have to ask yourself, you're looking at a scene, is this amazing scene? You have to ask yourself, where is the energy happening? Where is all of that detail and atmosphere in the photo? And how do I frame up my horizon line to reflect that? This is the very next morning of that exact same location that I was at. I got up for sunrise, went out there, and we were blessed with these amazing clouds that were mammatus clouds, and they happen just after or just before a storm rolls through. And since the opposite was happening here, where all the energy is in the sky, I filled up the sky with two-thirds of the frame instead of filling up two-thirds with the mountains. You can see the mountains are pretty much silhouetted in this situation because there wasn't a lot of light available. Using something like 1/4 of a second, 1/40th of a second, f11 and ISO 800, bringing in a lot of that light with my camera using those settings. The silhouetted mountain is an afterthought in this photo, right? You put it into the photo, but you put it way down at the bottom so that your frame, two-thirds of that frame is really filled up with a lot of the energy, a lot of the atmosphere that's going on in the photo. What makes the photo interesting? What's making you say, wow? And that's what you try to fill the frame with, if at all possible. Same thing here. Lots of negative space in the sky. Lots of cloudless sunrise going on here at Skull Rock and Joshua Tree National Park. But the sun adds just that little pop when you're using something like a sun star in a photo. Anything from like f11 to about f20 is going to give you more of a sun star in your photos. So this was at f11 ISO 800. And that's me walking through the frame in the background, timing this up on a Bluetooth remote from my phone to my camera to time it all up, just so. But you're filling the frame and putting your horizon line in the photo based on where the energy is, where all the interest is. And in this photo, it's in the rocks, it's in the big skull that dominates the majority of that frame. You have the sun that takes up a little bit of room and the hiker in the distance. I think what's really important about this topic of horizon lines, and it's one of the biggest mistakes that I see a lot of photographers making, especially in the courses and the live critique sessions that I teach in Landscape Photography University, is that people feel like they have to include a horizon line in the photo, or they feel like they have to include a sky in the photo. That's not always true in photography. When you ask yourself, where's the energy in the photo? You can also ask yourself, what is taking away from that energy? And if there's a cloudless sky, you get a lot of good light coming in from the side or the back or the front, and the sky is just blank, it's kind of distracting. You always try to reduce the amount of distracting elements in the photo. So I like to teach people in LPU, the most important thing to ask yourself in composition is, how do you increase attraction to your main subject of the photo, or what actually makes you say wow in a photo? And how can you decrease anything that's drawing your attention away from that subject in the photo? So your eye is always drawn to the brightest part of that photo. So if your sky is taking up space and it's the brightest part of the photo, guess where your eye is going to go? It's going to go directly to that bright part of the photo. But if you completely remove that part of the image and you just focus on these trees in a cypress swamp in the fall, illuminated with yellows and oranges and reds, and some greens in there too, then your eye is drawn directly to those bright leaves and the trees, which is the main subject of your photo. So always ask yourself, how do I increase attraction to my subject, and how do I decrease distraction away from my subject? Now I want to talk a little bit more about perspectives and how Hollywood can teach us photographers how to use perspectives in our photography as well. Now I want you to think about your favorite like superhero movie, okay? A lot of times in superhero movies, at the beginning, the hero is kind of this nobody, or they're lost, or they have a lot of questions to answer for themselves. When you think about it that way, let's take just like Spider-Man, for example. They're kind of this nerd. They're not bit by this, radioactive spider yet. And they're looked down upon as society as this like outcast. They don't have any heroic attributes to themselves yet. Hollywood usually portrays that person from a high perspective, showing you how society looks down on that person. It makes your subject feel smaller, feel more insignificant in a grander scene. That's kind of what I've done here in this photo in Great Smoky Mountains National Park of a dogwood tree across the river. This is in the Tremont area. If you guys ever go up to that location, beautiful spot to kind of just sit, take in the ambiance of the river and the spring leaves coming out, a lot of the river atmosphere. But I chose a higher perspective here to show how the grand landscape really morphs, the river morphs and makes the dogwood tree feel a lot more insignificant and smaller in the overall frame, how it becomes the smaller part of the grand landscape that you see here. And we can do that to show emotion, to show how to frame up and how to compose a photo to make somebody feel a certain way. Higher perspectives, looking down on your subjects, make them a little bit more insignificant and make a grand landscape actually seem a lot grander. Now, on the flip side of that, if you use a low perspective and photograph up at a subject, it makes it feel more powerful. These are aspen trees in the fall in Colorado, just radiating this luminous yellow off of their leaves. You see the tree trunks, that unique aspen tree trunk, and then also the deep blue sky that accompanies a lot of times September in Colorado. So beautiful scene here. But I want to refer you back to that superhero reference that we have. Once they get these powers, once they're in their hero moment, how are they portrayed in a film based on how they are at that moment? Usually it is a very low perspective shot and it makes them feel heroic. You call it the hero shot. And, it's that arms on the hips kind of shot that they have. And it's filmed from down below their waistline so that they seem larger in the frame and more powerful. The same thing can be done with your photography, shooting lower perspectives. Bigger trees, bigger, taller scenes make them feel grander, more powerful in the frame, and they take up a lot of space in the frame as well. Now, since we're talking about movies, we're talking about storytelling and framing up. I want to mention framing and telling the entire story, right? So when a lot of times when we're framing something up, we do get lost in the actual subject of a photo. And that could be people walking on a beach, that could be a boardwalk going out into an ocean sunset. But the details within the photo are important too. Those little small details, that make up an entire photo are just as important because they are characters in your story. We're talking about this superhero reference here, right? And we have that main character, the superhero in a movie. But a lot of times, there are additional characters that guide you through that story based on how they interact with the main character. The same is true for your photography. Every object that you decide to include in a photo is a character within your story that you have to portray the entire thing of. So I could have easily just focused on the actual two people walking down the beach here and their scale versus the entire size of the landscape here and these objects. But that would really take, if I did that, I probably wouldn't have lined up everything just so on the top or included the same amount of space on the top right side of the pier and the edge of the frame versus the top left side of the pier and the edge of the frame. Lining all those same spacings up throughout the entire photo tells that entire story. You include all of that. You don't negate any of that because if you do, it's kind of like introducing a character halfway through a movie and then all of a sudden you never hear from that character again. People are left thinking, well, where did that person go or where did that thing go and why aren't they included in the rest of the film? Here's another example of that. You may be saying, okay, I see the lighthouse here, but what are the other characters in this story? It's a lot of the lines, a lot of the highlights, the shadows. You see this dune ridge that's kind of framing up the foreground of the photo. Obviously, the subject is the lighthouse itself, but you see the dune ridge across the bottom, just sweeping from left to right across the entire frame. If I had just included that in the entire frame, you would be stuck. There would be foreground and then lighthouse. But you see on the right side how there's a little loop of sand going up the dune and sweeping around. There's a little, almost like a Nike swoosh going on the right side of the frame. That takes you from foreground and leads you into where the subject of the photo resides. So that helps you tell the story. That helps you lead somebody through the story of the photo that you're framing up. And it makes it more inviting and more interesting to your actual audience of your photos, whether that be somebody else or yourself. Let's also talk about visual contrast. This is something in composition that you can do to increase the impact of a photo. One of the ways you can do this is through scale. This is a hike in East Tennessee, and these cliffs that follow the trail kind of go along the entire thing. And you have these trees growing up alongside them and these big boulders that you have to climb over. And that's me in the photo, just a tiny little insignificant speck in the photo, but it shows you scale, small versus big. So that's what I want you to think of when you're thinking of visual contrast. How does this frame up the story here? What am I trying to tell in my composition? Is it big versus small? Versus, when you say that word versus, it shows you that there is a contrast within the photo. And a lot of people think of contrast as just a slider in Lightroom that you adjust and it separates out your highlights and your shadows in a photo. But contrasts are way more than that. They are differences. When you use that word versus, you're using a contrast in the story of your photo or the composition of your photo. Another way to do that is with color. And this is your standard color wheel. So with colors, you can use them to make a photo more energetic, or you can use them to make a photo seem a lot more calm. They actually did a study in a hospital setting that charted a patient's recovery time after a major surgery. After a major surgery, when they were exposed to opposite colors on the color wheel, so that would be in this situation yellow or purple, the patient actually took a longer time to recover because they faced much higher anxiety from the photos that they were exposed to because there were a lot more energy in those photos. They were a lot more impactful and jarring because of the opposite colors on that color wheel. So that would be red or green, yellow and purple, orange and blue, and all of those can make a lot of impact in a photo. Now, there have also been studies done on social media of what kinds of photos get the most attention, and those are photos with opposite colors on the color wheel, and those are called complementary colors. Now, in the hospital study, what was interesting is that they discovered that patients that were exposed to colors that were close to each other on the color wheel, so that would be like your green and then lime green, or darker orange and lighter orange, or the two blue tones. Photos that just had those kinds of colors actually saw a sped up amount of time that patients were recovering because they were exposed to calmer photos. So if you want a calm photo, you include colors that are close to each other on the color wheel. This photo of a mountain in Colorado would be an example of complementary colors, right? You have a red reflection of the morning sunlight coming off of this mountain paired with dark green trees down below. A lot of energy, a lot of complementary color visual contrast going on in this image. Likewise, with this photo, you get a lot of complementary colors going on, yellows and blues. That could also be thought of as temperatures in a photo. So temperatures, your color temperature, is another way that you can add visual contrast to a photo. So what are the two different colors on your temperature slider in Lightroom or whatever post-processing software that you're using? It's going to be yellow and it's going to be blue. The reason is that because you have warmer temperatures, being the yellow temperatures, and cooler or moodier temperatures, being more towards the blue side. In this situation, we had a really interesting storm rolling through. This is when my wife and I lived in Haiti. And we had these storms that would roll through every evening, and the sun was actually setting to the west and getting up under this storm cloud and illuminating only half of these storm clouds. A lot of that rain that was coming down was reflecting a lot of that yellow light. And then you had all the energy, the blue clouds over on the right side of the frame. So you have visual contrast with color temperature here too. You can also have visual contrast with slow or moving versus still, right? You get that a lot in waterfall photography. And we're in great locations, Tennessee, Georgia, all the way up into North Carolina, South Carolina. Tons of waterfalls going on in those regions that you can get to, that you can photograph this moving versus still. All the trees, all the rocks still, all the water moving. You can also do this without waterfalls. You can do something like a moving versus still kind of photo with something like star trail photography. So you can track the movement of these stars moving across the sky and circling around the subject of your actual photo. So think about these visual contrasts the next time you go out and take photos. How can you add that extra element of visual contrast, that extra element of interest to your composition next time you go out and take photos? What's going on around you? Take that initial shot, then look around you and think, what else is moving? What else is here? What do I see that can be that versus statement in my photography? Another really popular thing in composition that photographers talk about is called leading lines. Now, leading lines are really popular because they have the power to actually lead you into the frame, right? That's what a leading line is. It directs your viewer where to look in your frame and in what order. That's why they're so powerful and popular. But if they're not done the right way, you're kind of left wondering what is going on here. And Ansel Adams says it best when he says there's nothing worse than a sharp photo of a fuzzy idea or a fuzzy concept. He's talking about, yes, you can include something like a leading line in there, but if it leads to nothing, where's that viewer to go? It's kind of this photo of an introduction with no conclusion. That's kind of what you have with photos like this. I think a lot of times leading lines can attract you to a photo or attract you to a scene, but if that line doesn't actually introduce you to the subject of the photo or where the line should lead you to, sometimes it falls flat. And it's like 50% of the photo is there and 50% of the photo is not. And look, these are my own photos that I'm showing you, right? A lot of times I've taken photos like these too. And it's not to say that they're not enjoyable. I don't like taking them, but the best photos that I have are often the ones where a leading line is actually taking you to a destination. Let's look at that waterfall photo that we looked at just a second ago again. So shot at 2 seconds, f16 and ISO 100. And the lines using the movement of the water creates the lines that pull you into the frame, right? The leading lines usually come in from the bottom of the frame and pull the viewer into the photo. Now, all these lines direct you back towards that waterfall. I think that's why waterfall photography is so popular because it's so easy for the viewer to number one, find the subject, and number two, be pulled into the frame based on moving water and your use of longer exposures to pull you into that frame and direct you exactly to a subject. Here's another example of leading lines using pathways or trails to lead you to a subject. So you have the two trails converging into one, directing you back through the frame all the way back to the Rocky Mountains in the distance. You see that mountain peak in the very back. Now, I want you to imagine something. If this scene did not have the mountains in the background, what would this photo look like? It would just kind of be this trail leading you back into some trees and maybe some plains back into the distance. And where would that actually make the viewer wind up? This photo has the lines, it has the midground, and it has the conclusion in the background of where those lines are actually leading you within the frame. Now, leading lines don't always have to come in on the front of the photo or the bottom of the photo, I should say. They can also come in from the side of the photo. I believe this is Rutledge Falls in East Tennessee. Just a beautiful location. It's a waterfall that not a lot of people get out to. It's kind of out there, pretty far in the distance. But this is a really nice waterfall to visit because these rocks, it's kind of like a overlook, but then just drops off. And you can actually walk behind this waterfall, which is a really cool feature that it has. But all these lines pull you in from the right side of the frame around to the actual waterfall. Now, if the waterfall actually wasn't here, it would still pull you around the photo. But once your viewer ended up at the end of that cliff, and those rock lines, they'd kind of be like, well, okay, where do I go now? Like, what do I do now? It was fun going on that ride around those cliffs, but now that I'm there, where do I end up, right? What am I doing here in this photo? When you have a conclusion that's subject to where you've been taken, then they can explore the composition more and be taken through the entire photo. Now, foregrounds and leading lines are a little bit different. Leading lines are actual lines that take you through a photo, but foregrounds are typically a large anchor point into the front of your photo. Now, this is introducing us to the compositional idea that I like to call foreground, midground, background, or the three grounds technique. So you typically in these photos, you have a foreground, you have a midground, and you have a background, right? The subject usually resides in the midground or the background of the three ground technique. In this situation, the foreground in this lighthouse photo in Maine is this big, big tide pool that's formed from high tide. In this situation, the water is at low tide and it's left this pool behind. And you have all these breaks in the rock that's coming at you at the bottom of the frame that could be leading lines. But the anchor point, the weight, the heaviness of the composition is at the bottom of the photo, right? It's in the foreground. It's weighing you down. I'll go back through this photo again when we talk about midground and background, but I want to get to three different types of photos and show you what I'm talking about in the three different ones. Now, in the foreground of this was the bloom of this shrub in Colorado called the yellow rubber rabbit brush. So it's kind of a mouthful that you talk about, but these were just illuminating yellow in the mornings, and we had this amazing sunrise in the distance. But I was just caught by this particular shrub that we were photographing, and it's just this big anchor point in the foreground. I like to use the word anchor because it has that weight to the front of the photo, or the very bottom, the foreground of the photo. You can also do this horizontally. The last two examples have been vertical photos, but this is a horizontal photo. And the foreground, that anchor point, the line of trees that's going across the bottom of the frame in front of the Teton mountain range. Let's look at when we have the ideas of these foregrounds, I want you to think about how close can you actually get to your subject. So in this situation, we're really close to this foreground that I'm framing up in this photo. It almost looks distorted. This was with a 12 mm lens. So things in the foreground are really close to the actual toes on my boots or the legs on my tripod. Now, when you have something like that, you may ask yourself, okay, do I get this all in one shot, or do I do something like focus stacking where I take one photo that focuses on the foreground and the next photo that focuses on the background? I want you to think about, and maybe I'm just a lazy photographer, and I don't know if any of you feel like me, but the less amount of work I have to do to get a photo that I like is the route I'm going to take, right? I like to use hyperfocal distance before anything. And if that sounds like a really crazy educated word to use, all you have to know about it pretty much is this right here. You focus at f16 or smaller to about halfway between the bottom third of your frame and the bottom of the frame. If you focus to that point, so in this situation, it would be those very bottom blossoms of this shrub. Everything into infinity will be in acceptable focus. So when you follow that principle, a lot of times these shots at f16 will come out really, really clean, and you don't have to use anything like focus tech. Okay, that's usually a question that comes up at this point, and I will take any questions at the end for a quick Q&A session if you guys have any questions at the end. Let's talk about midgrounds. In midgrounds, we'll take this situation again. This is that lighthouse photo. And in the midground, you have the actual trees and the lighthouse itself. So you have foreground of the tide pool, midground, lighthouse, and trees. In this situation, the midground would actually be the plains where all the other yellow shrubs are blossoming in this actual photo. And in this situation, it would be the fog that separates the trees from the mountains. Okay, so those are your midgrounds. Backgrounds. Backgrounds in this situation would be the blue sky with the clouds that fill up the majority of the sky. These are cumulus. These aren't cumulus clouds, but they're forming into something that would be a cumulus cloud. They're a bit sparse in the sky and don't take up a lot of that sky space. In this situation, the background would be the San Juan Mountains in the distance, right? San Juan Mountains with a sky that's on fire in the distance. And in this situation, the background would be the Grand Teton mountain range in the very back. It's easy to think about the three ground technique. It's often difficult to find all three grounds within the photo, right? A lot of times you can find a foreground and a background, but it's really difficult when conditions come together to get that midground in there. It's often the most missed part of the three ground technique. Now, you don't have to have all three in the photo, but it does add to a lot of more impactful photos when you have all three in there. Now, the question that a lot of people have is, can you break these rules? Absolutely. I think photos with broken rules are often the most interesting and the most creative. Let's take this photo of Jenny Lake in Grand Teton National Park. This is just at sunrise when you have some of the alpenglow on top of this mountain and you have a clean reflection in the lake in front of you. This would be an example of breaking the rules because the horizon line where Earth is separated into two goes directly across the center of the frame where you get reflection of mountain in the lake versus mountain in the sky. Now, you can also break the rules by not adding anything at all and just zooming in on your subject of the photo and secluding it out. I often think that these are my favorite photos because of the composition rule that we talked about earlier, and that's increase attraction, decrease distraction. How do you increase all the attraction and decrease all the distraction? You just zoom right in on your subject and you photograph it similar like you would do with a person's portrait, right? This is a mountain portrait. You photograph it where it takes up the entire frame. And in this instance, it was encircled by all this fog, these low clouds in the Teton Valley. Just an amazing morning. But if you struggle with figuring out there's so many distractions. I'm torn in a lot of different directions with my composition. Just try putting on a telephoto lens and zooming directly in on the subject of the photo. Or don't even have a subject at all and use some abstract versions of a location. I've shown you some photos from Great Sand Dune National Park so far, but this one was kind of no subject at all. It was just a lot of these repeating patterns and lines and highlights and shadows going off into the distance. And using a telephoto lens instead of a wide angle lens compresses those distances and almost stacks these ridges of sand dunes right on top of each other. Now, if we think about where we live in our regions, what kinds of things are stackable with a telephoto lens? It would be mountains. And we have a lot of good ones in the Appalachian region where you have a lot of those mountain ridges stacked closer together using a telephoto lens. You can do that high up in the elevations of Great Smoky Mountains National Park, where Tennessee meets the North Carolina border. Now, here's the part of this that is going to be a huge unlock for a lot of you. Now, we've talked about foreground, midground, background, rule of thirds, hyperfocal distance, right? Anchor points in the photo, visual contrast in your composition. And maybe a lot of that is swirling around in your head. I think the biggest takeaway from tonight is going to be seeing a location as shapes rather than actual subjects. And this might be a little abstract the way I'm describing it right now. But when you see a photo like this, what kind of shapes do you see? Now, granted, this isn't like my best photo that I've ever taken. This was just hiking with some friends, and I took just a point and shoot camera with us when we were going out. But you can see, he's kind of walking over this waterfall. It's framed up to have the water coming at you. What do you see here? Do you see a person and a waterfall, or do you see a rectangle and a triangle, right? And I'll superimpose these on top of one another in just a minute so you can visualize this a lot better. What do you see here? Do you see a mountain and the moon? Or do you see triangles even in negative spaces and circles? There are a lot of different shapes that you can use in the landscape. So here's the superimposed version of a triangle and a rectangle. You see the waterfall in the triangle shape down at the bottom of the frame, and then you have the rectangle of the forest in the background, or this photo in Grand Teton National Park. You see the mountain itself is a triangle. Then you have triangular negative space shapes on the right and the left. And then you have a circular moon that's setting directly over that mountain peak. So when you see locations as shapes rather than objects, you can frame up some really interesting photos. This was just kind of this big building in Pittsburgh that I just stumbled upon when I was traveling with my wife, and I took just a quick shot of this. And I was just really taken aback with all the circles that are going on in this photo. So in the actual dome of this place right in front of a hotel where you can pull your cars through, you have all these circles. And architecture photography, city photography, travel photography, you can find tons of shapes in man-made objects. So you have circles going on in the dome of this. Then you have circular shapes or arches that are in the background of this. Then all these little windows down where you can see directly through where a lot of these archways come together. And then the big opening where I'm shooting through in the foreground of the photo is a big circular archway as well. So you can find a lot of these different circles, shapes, lines in your photos as well. Aspen trees photographed with a telephoto lens stacked together, just a bunch of lines in your photo. And when you can get these repeating patterns, repeating shapes in a photo, a lot of these interesting compositions start to come together. In this photo, what do you see? Well, you can see a lot of lines in the rocks that are pulling you from left and right in these corners back to the linear waterfall that's in the background. You also have a lot of lines and striations in the actual rock that's behind the waterfall itself that kind of plays up those linear patterns that are going on in the photo. Well, what about this? You have a curved line that's your leading line into your foreground that takes you back through the frame. So leading lines can be shapes as well. What about rectangles? You can find a lot of rectangles in photos too. Architecture photography, travel photography, again, has a lot of these shapes and repeating patterns coming up as well. Bricks. Every single brick is a rectangle. Every single window is a rectangle. You even have squares that are occurring in all this, and you can frame those up. Here's the photo of the sunrise and the two people walking that I showed you a little bit earlier. But how many rectangles, or I guess if you're a proper geometry person, these would be like a rhombus or this type of, again, I wasn't the best math student, so forgive me if I'm getting that shape wrong, but these repeating patterns over and over. Now, triangles are my favorite because triangles are the strongest shape that you can use in landscape photography to frame up your photo. And how triangles work is they're literally arrows that are pointing you exactly where you need to be looking. In this photo that I showed you just a little while ago at the very beginning, using a rule of thirds example, in this situation, you have triangles. The mountain itself is a triangle. This dip in the mountain where a glacier used to be, where it carved out that part of the mountain where that light is spilling down through that space is triangle as well. So it doesn't have to be an actual like mountain to be a triangle. It can be negative space or the way the light is hitting the landscape to make up these shapes. Let's look at this waterfall in the Smokies, and you can see there are tons of triangles going on in this photo. Even in some of the negative spaces where the water is coming in between these triangular rocks is an actual triangle itself. So there's so many triangles that you can find in landscape photography. There's so many shapes that you can find in all genres of photography. It's just how you frame them up in the composition. And you can even use multiple shapes in your photos. Here's that photo that we were looking at just earlier. So you have all these lines in the fence post going back into the frame. You have rectangular shapes in the cabin that's in the distance. Then you have triangles on the side of that cabin, even up on the top, where you get those little posts kind of extending on the rooftop. And then each one of these little rocks, these boulders that have been weathered by storms, are little circles going on in the landscape as well. So think about these shapes. It's not just subjects that you're photographing. How can you use shapes to point your viewer exactly where you want them to look? Because in its simplest form, composition is just a roadmap for your viewer on where to look when, right? So you go through these shapes and you find lines or triangles to point you to rectangles or circles. That's pretty much what composition is, and finding these shapes. You have a lot of different shapes going on. Triangles, this has tons of triangles going on in it, not just the trees, but the negative spaces, the mountains themselves in the photo. This tree in the highest point in Tennessee that's sadly no longer there. It fell over a few months ago during a hurricane that blew through. But this shape is a triangular shape with a circle in the distance. Or you could have a scene that's split into two rectangles, or a rectangle and a square, that helps you take up photos. Now, I mentioned repetition with our shapes, right? And repetition is important because it helps us see repeating objects or repeating shapes. This is kind of that idea of stacked mountain ridges going into the distance with a telephoto lens. But look at all the repetition going on of actual ridges of these mountains, right? There are so many ridges going on in this photo that it creates that interesting image. Repetition and repeating natural shapes is always a winner in your photography. So look at this situation here, right? You may say, well, okay, I only see one cliff face, this one mountain, and some trees, but what else is there? Well, all these different rocks, while they may be slightly different in shape, they're all repeating shapes of these rocks going into the distance. One of my favorite hacks for landscape photography in particular is natural windows. And I love to photograph through things. I think my favorite thing to photograph through and out of is the opening of a cave. Now, caves aren't always the safest things to go down into, but when you can find one and you can frame up a story out of the mouth of a cave, it makes this amazing natural window that you can photograph with fall leaves in the distance, a hiker walking across the mouth of the cave, and it just creates this really interesting window that you're seeing through now. Or if you're doing travel photography or cityscape photography, this is a gondola. It's like a train in Pittsburgh that takes you up, that overlooks the entire city of Pittsburgh. But I photographed this with looking through the actual windows of this, I'll call it a gondola, this gondola that looks out over the city of Pittsburgh with the city in the distance. Um, Now, one of the more advanced concepts of composition is called directional flow or direction of flow. And the direction of flow is basically in what order you're exploring a photo. So in this situation, you are entered, or in this situation, you're introduced with the actual long exposure water that's coming at you in the frame. Now, your flow is directly from the bottom of the frame. You go up those lines and you see the waterfall itself. Sometimes that's all directional flow actually is where you start and where you finish. In a photo like this, it's a little bit more complicated because you have those long exposure lines that you can see in the photo. But as you circle around the edge of the frame, you kind of travel with these lines and you go around the right side of the bend of that frame. Then you see the fall color in the canopy of the trees. And then you see a waterfall in the distance. And that waterfall, the outflow of the waterfall spits you out into the calm water. Then you're taken back through this maze of all these different long exposure lines and leaves and colors, and you go around and around and around. That's directional flow. When you're able to pull your viewer through different sections of the image in a particular order. So they can start either at the waterfall, they travel down through these leaves and long exposures. The leaves swirl them back up to the right, where they then find the tree canopy and then they're spit out at the waterfall again. So they go around and around and around and they can explore different things. You can do it with abstract natural designs and landscape photography too. So this would be an example of a natural design. It's these mud tiles in Death Valley National Park, just so fun to photograph. This is a black and white shot of one of them. And directional flow, you can see with those two tiles, they take you around from basically top right to bottom left, and then back up to top right again. Now, when you're doing these, I think especially a lot of times when you're thinking about framing up your subject and your subject placement, you have to watch what's called edge patrol. Edge patrol is basically you just taking a photo, looking at the back of your camera, your LCD screen, and you're thinking, is anything cut off or is anything intruding into the frame? So in this situation, I had to frame it up just right because everything is so like straight line, rectangle, and then square at the top. I had to really watch where the antlers were coming in on the right side and how close the feet were to the bottom of the frame. Same thing with this photo of a giraffe in Kenya. I had to watch how close the feet were to the actual bottom of the frame while it was walking pretty quickly across in front of these acacia trees in the background. I had to separate out the two trees and the giraffe so nothing would overlap one another, but I still watch its feet as it walked across the plane so I didn't cut off the bottom of the feet. The same thing with this photo that I've showed you a few different times. That bush, and you see those limbs really reaching towards the bottom of the frame there. I took this photo 3 or 4 different times because every single time I would notice that those limbs were too close or either being cut off by the bottom of the frame. I had to get wide enough and scoot back just enough to get it close to the bottom of the frame, but not cut off. Same thing with macro photography, right? You don't want your subjects too close to the right or cut off from that section. Yeah, even in the background, if something is blurry, you have to be sure it's not getting too close to that edge or cut off by that edge. So you're constantly doing this edge patrol to see if anything is encroaching on the photo or being taken away by the edge of the frame. Complementary subjects are an interesting one in composition because I like to think of it again as a movie. So with complementary subjects, you have the main subject that's in the photo, and then you have that would be your lead actor in the photo, and then you have a secondary subject that complements that subject, your main subject. So this would basically be like your lead actor and then your best supporting actor, right? The best supporting actor, its job is to add just enough to the frame or to the movie and yet not take away from the lead actor role, right? You have to support that lead actor, but not take away from the glory. So in this situation, the elk that's doing its mating call in the bottom of the frame is the main subject, but the complementary subject that frames up the entire thing is the mountain with alpenglow in the distance. Now, sometimes you could say, hey, you may have a third coming in here of the river down below, but I would refer you back to the old Batman and Robin TV show and films. When you have two, it's just enough, right? You start throwing other characters in there, it may get a little bit complicated. So try to stick with this idea of main subject and then complementary subject. So I mentioned to Wade when we were getting started, I wanted to offer you guys a free webinar that I do. It's on demand, so you don't have to sign up and be there at a certain time. This is on demand, so you could go home and do it tonight. But I teach all these concepts in great depth and detail, plus many more about editing photography, being out in the field, how to plan your photography, and do photography summits that happen twice a year with the best photographers on the planet doing virtual webinars themselves. It's called Landscape Photography University. Some of the people I've helped are like Trey, who LPU gave Trey a checklist for when he goes out that gives him confidence, or Mike Beliveau that started sending in photos like this cactus at the very top. That's a good photo and a cool photo, but now he's taking photos like the bottom frame, photos that have gotten him invited to speak at photography events, even having people ask him to buy his prints as well. And I've helped hundreds of photographers on LPU giving 5-star reviews. What I want you guys to do is view that free webinar. It's on demand. Again, if you just opt in, you'll be granted access to that webinar. So if you go to landscapephotographyuniversity.com/opt-in, you can put in your email address and get that that free webinar. You can also use this QR code to access it if you like to use QR codes. I think it's the fastest way to do things. But yeah, I'll leave this up on the frame for just a minute so you guys can write that down or use the QR code. But I do want to take some questions. If anybody has questions about anything that we went over tonight, I would be more than happy to answer those, because I know I tend to get excited about photography. I talk really fast. My wife likes to tell me that I'm screaming at the computer when I'm in here. So any questions that anybody has, I'd be happy to answer those.
Thanks, we really appreciate it, David. So I have one question to start. What is the balance when you're doing your photography between pre-visualization of what you're going for in the field versus editing, in terms of getting the images that you really want?
Yeah, that's a great question. It's really, for me, it's divided into thirds, and they're all connected. I think it's easy to connect, like 1/3 of the process is the planning or visualization, where you go scouting or you look up some images online of that location to get an idea of what's there. The second part of the process, or the second of the thirds part of the process, again, I'm not good at math, is actually taking the photo, creating your composition based on what's actually in the field, the conditions that are there, the weather that's there, what the light is doing. So those two parts are really easy to connect, right? You've planned the location, and then you're going out to take the actual photo, right? The third part is the editing part, and it's 33% effort on every single one. The most common disconnect in the process is going from infield to editing, because a lot of times people take the photo and then they're like, well, I'll just like fix that in post-processing, or I'll just like lighten the highlights, darken the shadows, create more contrast in the image in post-processing. You have to edit based on what you are actually photographing in the field. In my process, what I like to do is edit those photos quickly because that experience is still fresh on my mind, right? I remember the weather that was there. I remember the light. And what I like to do is have a process of edits that I go through. So when I'm connecting the editing process with the infield and taking the photo, I'm looking at what can I edit with the entire photo. So those would be global edits or edits that impact the entire photo. And then I go through and edit locally. So that would be making masks or doing adjustments in the photo, dodging and burning. And then once I churn those out, I take a step back and I look at the photo and I'm like, did I successfully link the editing with what I was doing in the field? Sometimes that answer is no. And you have to go back through and figure out, what part of the process is the disconnect. But a lot of times, if you do it that way and you have a system in place instead of just guessing on what, like moving a slider, and I've been there too, moving a slider and just see what it does in the photo versus having an actual process. I think the connection is a lot stronger when you're able to do that over and over and over. And that takes time and practice too. But having that process allows you to go through that practice a lot faster.
All right, thanks. Any other questions? Anybody remote have a question? Yeah, I think everybody's still digesting. So
It was a lot of information.
it's a lot to
It
come
was a
in, but
lot
we really
there, but
appreciate it. I think you gave us a lot of food for thought.
good, good. Well, look, guys, I really appreciate it. I know you're gonna get to the announcement part of your meeting, but I really appreciate this, guys. Truly, I love photo clubs and camera clubs. I think they're the backbone to keeping the joy of photography alive. So thank you guys so much.